Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into one of history's most challenging questions: why do good people suffer? We're exploring the story of Job, a man whose extraordinary prosperity was matched only by his extraordinary faith, until both were tested in ways that would shatter every assumption about how the world works. In an ancient cosmic courtroom where angels gathered and accusations flew, this wealthy patriarch became the unwitting subject of the ultimate experiment. Can faith survive when everything that seems to support it is stripped away? His journey from the heights of blessing to the depths of despair and back again remains the most profound exploration of suffering, faith, and divine justice ever recorded, a story that refuses to offer easy answers while revealing truths that can only be discovered through the fire of unimaginable trial. So, without further ado, let's begin. In the land of Uz, where the desert winds carved canyons through limestone cliffs and ancient trade routes connected the civilizations of Mesopotamia with the kingdoms of the south, there lived a man whose prosperity had become legend throughout the region. His name was Job, and in an age when a man's worth was measured by the size of his flocks, the loyalty of his servants, and the reverence of his children, few could match the abundance that surrounded this patriarch like a fortress built of divine blessing. The territory of Uz stretched across the borderlands between settled civilization and nomadic wilderness, a place where Chaldean raiders and Sabian merchants moved like shadows across landscapes that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires since the days when Abraham first journeyed from Ur toward the Promised Land. Here, in this crossroads of ancient commerce and constant danger, Job had built an empire that testified to both his wisdom in worldly affairs and his faithfulness to the God whose providence governed all human destiny. 7,000 sheep grazed on the hillsides that rolled like green waves toward the horizon, their wool providing the raw material for textiles that found eager markets in Damascus, Babylon, and the ports of the Mediterranean coast. 3,000 camels, those ships of the desert whose endurance made long distance trade possible, carried goods along routes that connected Job's holdings to the great commercial networks of the ancient world. 500 yoke of oxen plowed fields that yielded harvests abundant enough to feed not only his own household, but the families of servants whose loyalty had been earned through years of generous treatment. The 500 donkeys that bore his mark represented more than mere pack animals. They symbolized the careful organization that had transformed a single man's enterprise into an economic force that influenced the prosperity of entire regions. Merchants planning expeditions across the desert sought Job's counsel, knowing that his understanding of trade winds and tribal movements, of seasonal patterns and political upheavals, had been refined through decades of successful navigation through the uncertainties that governed commerce in the ancient world. Yet, it was not the magnitude of Job's material possessions that truly set him apart from his contemporaries. Impressive as these holdings were, in an age when most men counted themselves fortunate to own a few goats and a patch of barely arable land, the measure of his distinction lay rather in the character that had earned him recognition not merely as a successful businessman, but as a man whose integrity had become proverbial throughout the region. The servants who managed his vast enterprises spoke of their master with a reverence that went beyond the fear that typically governed relationships between powerful men and those who depended upon them for their livelihood. Job's justice in settling disputes, his generosity toward those who served him faithfully, and his concern for the welfare of all who lived within the sphere of his influence had created a loyalty that money alone could never purchase. When caravans rested at the wells that marked the boundaries of his territory, the conversations around evening fires often turned to stories of Job's wisdom in counsel, his fairness in negotiation, and his reliability in keeping agreements even when changing circumstances might have provided excuses for renegotiation. Travelers carried these accounts to distant cities, where Job's reputation preceded him in markets he had never visited, and opened doors to opportunities that lesser men could never have imagined. But the foundation of Job's character rested upon something deeper than shrewd business practices or enlightened treatment of employees. In an age when religious observance was often corrupted by superstition and the worship of the Creator contaminated by accommodation to local deities, Job maintained a faith that was both pure in its devotion and practical in its daily expression. Every morning, before the sun painted the eastern mountains with the promise of another day's labor, Job could be found in prayer, offering sacrifices according to the ancient patterns that connected his worship to the covenant traditions that had been preserved since the days of Noah. The altar that he had built with his own hands stood as a permanent reminder that all prosperity flowed from divine blessing, that human success was meaningful only when it served purposes larger than personal accumulation. His children, 7 sons and 3 daughters whose beauty and wisdom had become subjects of admiration throughout the region, had been raised in the knowledge that their father's wealth carried with it responsibilities that extended beyond their immediate family. The education they received prepared them not merely to inherit and manage the enterprises that Job had built, but to serve as instruments of justice and mercy in a world where power was too often wielded without conscience. The sons had established their own households, each one a center of prosperity that reflected the principles they had learned at their father's table. The eldest, Eliphaz, had inherited his father's gift for understanding the patterns that govern trade and agriculture, building upon the foundation of inherited wealth to extend the family's influence into new regions and new enterprises. Bildad, the second son, had distinguished himself as a counselor whose wisdom attracted seekers from distant lands, earning a reputation for insight that rivaled the sages of Babylon and Egypt. Zophar, the youngest of the sons, had combined his inheritance with an adventurous spirit that led him to explore trade routes that more cautious merchants avoided, establishing relationships with tribal leaders and city-state rulers that opened new possibilities for commercial expansion. Each brother understood that his individual success served the larger purpose of maintaining and extending the legacy that their father had built through decades of faithful stewardship. The 3 daughters, whose names were never recorded in the ancient accounts, a silence that reflected the customs of an age when women's identities were often subsumed within their relationships to fathers, husbands, and sons, possessed beauty that was spoken of in terms usually reserved for legendary figures. Yet their education had equipped them with wisdom that matched their physical gifts, preparing them to serve as worthy partners to men whose own character and prospects reflected the standards that Job had established for his family. The gatherings that brought the siblings together for the festivals that marked the turning of seasons and the celebration of family milestones had become events that drew observers from throughout the region. The wisdom of their conversations, the grace of their hospitality, and the obvious affection that bound them together served as testimony to the success of Job's efforts to raise children who would honor both their family heritage and the God who had blessed their father with such abundance. Yet even as Job took legitimate pride in the achievements of his children and the prosperity of his enterprises, his spiritual sensitivity created within him a constant awareness of the dangers that attended great blessing. Wealth could corrupt the heart that received it, success could breed pride that forgot its divine source, and prosperity could create a false sense of security that displaced trust in the providence that had made such abundance possible. This understanding led Job to a practice that set him apart even from other righteous men of his generation. Whenever his children gathered for their celebrations, whenever the joy of family fellowship might have created opportunities for excess or carelessness in spiritual matters, Job rose early the next morning to offer sacrifices on their behalf, saying to himself, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." The sacrificial fires that burned on Job's altar each morning after his children's gatherings represented more than parental concern for their spiritual welfare. They embodied a theological understanding that recognized the subtle ways in which prosperity could undermine the faith that had made such prosperity possible. Job understood that the greatest danger facing his family was not external threat from raiders or commercial competitors, but internal corruption that could transform blessing into curse through the pride and self-sufficiency that wealth so easily fostered. The morning ritual of sacrifice served as both intercession for his children and reminder to himself that all human achievement remained subject to divine sovereignty, that earthly success was meaningful only when it served eternal purposes, and that the proper response to blessing was not self-congratulation, but deeper humility before the one whose goodness had made such blessing possible. In the councils where regional leaders gathered to discuss matters of mutual concern, trade agreements, responses to tribal movements, preparations for seasonal challenges that threatened the stability upon which all prosperity depended, Job's voice carried weight that derived not merely from his economic influence, but from the moral authority that his character had earned through years of consistent integrity. When disputes arose between merchants, when conflicts emerged between settled communities and nomadic groups, when the complexities of international commerce created situations that required wisdom beyond mere legal expertise, Job's judgment was sought by men who understood that his perspective transcended narrow self-interest. His decisions reflected principles that served the common good while maintaining the justice that preserved trust in the systems upon which civilized society depended. The reputation that Job had earned as a man whose word could be trusted absolutely, whose judgments reflected divine wisdom, and whose prosperity served purposes larger than personal aggrandizement, had created around him a sphere of influence that extended far beyond the boundaries of his immediate holdings. Rulers in distant cities knew his name, merchants planning complex expeditions sought his advice, and young men aspiring to success in commerce or governance looked to his example as a model worthy of emulation. Yet for all the recognition that Job's achievements had earned him among his contemporaries, the source of his deepest satisfaction lay not in human praise, but in the knowledge that his life reflected the character of the God he served, the integrity that governed his business dealings, the justice that characterized his treatment of servants and subordinates, the generosity that marked his response to those in need, all flowed from a heart that had been shaped by meditation upon divine truth and daily surrender to divine will. As the sun set each evening over the vast holdings that testified to Job's success, as the sounds of prosperity, lowing cattle, bleating sheep, the voices of servants completing their appointed tasks, settled into the peaceful rhythms of another day's faithful stewardship, Job would often pause to consider the goodness of the God who had blessed him with such abundance. The prayers that concluded each day reflected not merely gratitude for material prosperity, but recognition that earthly blessing carried with it spiritual responsibilities that extended beyond temporal concerns. Job understood that his wealth was a trust to be managed for divine purposes, that his influence was a platform for advancing justice and mercy, and that his success was meaningful only insofar as it served the larger purposes of the one who had chosen to bless him beyond anything he could have deserved or imagined. In this season of abundance and recognition, when every circumstance of Job's life seemed to confirm the principle that righteousness leads to blessing and faithfulness produces prosperity, few could have imagined that forces were already in motion that would transform this paragon of success into the supreme example of suffering faith. The testing that awaited this righteous man would challenge not merely his material security, but the theological assumptions that had shaped his understanding of how divine justice operated in human affairs. The God who had blessed Job so abundantly was about to demonstrate that the relationship between righteousness and reward, between faithfulness and prosperity, was more complex than even the most thoughtful believers might suppose. In the heavenly councils where the destiny of nations and individuals was determined according to purposes that transcended human understanding, a conversation was about to take place that would transform Job's life into a theater where the deepest questions about faith, suffering, and divine sovereignty would be explored through the crucible of unimaginable loss. The scene that unfolded in the throne room of heaven possessed a grandeur that no earthly court could approximate, yet its implications would reshape the life of a man who remained unaware that his existence had become the subject of cosmic attention. Around the throne of the Almighty, whose glory burned with intensity that made the sun appear as mere candlelight, the sons of God assembled for that regular convocation where the affairs of creation were reviewed and the purposes of providence were advanced through means both visible and hidden. These heavenly beings, whose understanding encompassed the movements of galaxies and the fall of sparrows, whose service had witnessed the creation of worlds and the rise and fall of civilizations, gathered in perfect harmony around the One whose will governed all existence. Their worship rose like incense from the crystal sea that stretched before the throne, each voice contributing to a symphony of praise that had continued without interruption since the morning when the stars first sang together in celebration of divine creative power. Yet on this particular day, the harmony of heavenly worship was disrupted by a presence that carried with it the discord of rebellion, the bitter notes of accusation that had first introduced chaos into the perfect order of creation. Satan, whose name meant adversary and whose nature had been corrupted from its original purpose through pride and envy, presented himself among the sons of God with the brazen confidence of one who had secured certain rights through the fall of humanity into sin. The contrast between the accuser and the faithful angels could not have been more stark, where they radiated the joy that flowed from perfect submission to divine will. He emanated the restless energy of one whose rebellion had transformed him into an enemy of everything good and beautiful. Where their presence enhanced the glory that surrounded the throne, his very being seemed to absorb light and transform it into shadow, creating around himself an atmosphere of cynicism and doubt that challenged the foundations of faith itself. The Lord's question to this intruder carried both the weight of divine authority and the patience of one whose purposes could not be thwarted by any created opposition. From where do you come? The inquiry was not born of ignorance, for omniscience needed no information from finite sources, but rather served to expose the nature of Satan's activities and the motivation that drove his constant movement throughout creation. Satan's response revealed both his character and his mission, from going to and fro on the earth, and from walking back and forth on it. The restless wandering that he described reflected the aimless energy of one whose rebellion had cut him off from the purposeful service that gave meaning to existence. Like a predator stalking prey, he roamed through human affairs, seeking opportunities to advance his kingdom of darkness through the corruption of those whom God had created for fellowship with himself. The geographical scope of Satan's wandering encompassed more than mere physical movement. It represented a systematic survey of human civilization designed to identify weaknesses that could be exploited for destructive purposes. He had observed the rise and fall of kingdoms, the prosperity and poverty of individuals, the success and failure of human enterprises, always seeking evidence that would support his fundamental accusation against both divine goodness and human worthiness. In the courts of kings, he had witnessed the corruption that power inevitably produced, the compromise of principles that accompanied political advancement, the betrayal of trust that marked the pursuit of earthly glory. In the marketplaces of great cities, he had observed the greed that transformed legitimate commerce into exploitation, the dishonesty that undermined the foundations of economic exchange, the selfishness that reduced human relationships to calculations of personal advantage. Among the common people whose lives unfolded far from centers of power and influence, Satan had documented the envy that poisoned community relationships, the bitterness that arose from comparative disadvantage, the despair that accompanied economic hardship and social rejection. Every human weakness, every moral failure, every spiritual compromise had been cataloged in his mental repository as evidence for the case he had been building against the human race since the fall in Eden. Yet despite the thoroughness of his investigation and the comprehensiveness of his accusations, Satan's wandering had been frustrated by encounters with individuals whose faith seemed to transcend the limitations that characterize most human responses to divine blessing and earthly trial. These exceptional people represented anomalies in his otherwise systematic indictment of human nature, examples of faithfulness that challenged his core assertion that human devotion to God was entirely conditional upon divine favor. It was this frustration that led the Lord to direct Satan's attention toward the most troubling example of genuine righteousness that existed in the world of that generation. Have you considered, my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil? The divine commendation of Job carried implications that reached far beyond personal recognition of individual righteousness. In describing his servant as blameless and upright, God was not claiming sinless perfection for any human being, but rather identifying Job as one whose heart was wholly devoted to divine purposes, whose character reflected the righteousness that came through faith, and whose life demonstrated the possibility of authentic spirituality even in a fallen world. The phrase, "one who fears God," revealed the foundation upon which Job's entire character had been built. This fear was not the terror that sinners experience when confronted with divine holiness, but rather the reverent awe that recognizes the infinite worthiness of the Creator and responds with worship that encompasses every aspect of existence. Job's fear of God had produced in him a hatred of evil that was not merely intellectual, but deeply emotional, a revulsion against sin that reflected his understanding of how rebellion against divine goodness corrupted everything it touched. Satan's response to this divine commendation revealed both his tactical brilliance and his fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of authentic faith. Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge around him, around his household, and around all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But now stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. The accusation that Satan leveled against Job struck at the heart of every question about human motivation that had ever been raised in discussions of religious devotion. Was genuine faith possible, or were all expressions of spiritual commitment merely sophisticated forms of selfishness designed to secure divine favor? Did people serve God out of love for his character, or were they motivated primarily by desire for the blessings that such service might produce? The metaphor of the hedge that Satan employed in his accusation revealed his understanding of the protective care that God exercised over those who served him faithfully. This divine protection was not merely physical, though it certainly included preservation from dangers that might have destroyed less carefully guarded lives. It encompassed also spiritual protection from temptations that might have overwhelmed weaker faith, emotional protection from discouragements that might have produced despair, and providential protection from circumstances that might have prevented the full development of character. Yet Satan's interpretation of this protection as evidence of conditional faith revealed his inability to comprehend the relationship between divine blessing and human response that characterized genuine spirituality. He assumed that Job's righteousness was maintained only because it was rewarded, that his faithfulness continued only because it was profitable, and that his worship would cease the moment it became costly rather than beneficial. The challenge that Satan proposed, "stretch out your hand and touch all that he has," represented more than a suggestion for testing Job's faith. It constituted a direct assault upon the integrity of divine justice itself. The accuser was claiming that God's commendation of Job was based upon incomplete information, that the righteousness which appeared so admirable was actually a form of sophisticated hypocrisy, and that authentic faith was impossible under any circumstances because human nature was incapable of truly selfless devotion. The permission that God granted to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your power. Only do not lay a hand on his person," established both the scope and the limitations of the testing that would follow. The adversary was authorized to attack Job's possessions, his family, his social standing, and his emotional security, but the life of the servant himself remained under divine protection. This limitation revealed that the testing was designed not to destroy Job, but to demonstrate the reality of his faith, not to prove human weakness, but to vindicate divine wisdom in choosing such a man as the supreme example of earthly righteousness. The cosmic implications of this heavenly conversation extended far beyond the individual experience of one righteous man in the land of Uz. The question being adjudicated through Job's coming trial was whether the relationship between God and humanity could transcend the merely transactional, whether love could exist without calculation of reward, and whether faith could persist in the absence of immediate blessing. For Satan, Job's testing would provide either vindication of his cynical assessment of human nature or devastating refutation of his accusations against both divine goodness and human possibility. If Job's faith proved conditional upon prosperity, the adversary would have demonstrated that all human righteousness was essentially selfish, that divine favor was wasted upon creatures incapable of genuine devotion, and that the entire project of redemption was built upon false assumptions about human potential. For God, the testing would demonstrate that his assessment of Job's character was accurate, that authentic faith was indeed possible even in a fallen world, and that the relationship between creator and creature could transcend the limitations that Satan insisted were inherent in human nature. The vindication of Job's integrity would serve as proof that divine wisdom in choosing and blessing certain individuals was not misplaced, that righteousness could exist for its own sake, rather than merely as a means to an end. As the heavenly council dispersed and the sons of God returned to their appointed tasks throughout creation, Satan departed with the authorization he had sought and the dark anticipation of one who believed that the coming test would finally provide irrefutable evidence for the accusations he had been leveling against humanity since the fall. The tools at his disposal, natural disasters, human enemies, economic collapse, family tragedy, would be deployed with strategic precision designed to strip away every source of comfort and security that might have sustained faith through lesser trials. Yet even as the adversary planned his assault upon Job's prosperity and peace, the divine purpose behind the coming suffering remained hidden in the wisdom of one whose thoughts transcended the understanding of both angels and men. The testing that would transform the prosperous patriarch into the supreme example of suffering faith was motivated not by divine cruelty, but by divine love, designed not to destroy, but to demonstrate, intended not to disprove, but to vindicate the possibility of authentic relationship between heaven and earth. The stage was set for the most comprehensive examination of faith under fire that had ever been undertaken in human history. In the coming days, Job would lose everything that had defined his identity, everything that had provided security, everything that had given meaning to his existence, everything, that is, except the faith that would prove stronger than prosperity, more enduring than earthly blessing, and more precious than life itself. The man who had been distinguished by his righteousness was about to become legendary for his suffering. The patriarch whose wisdom had been sought by regional leaders was about to become the supreme example of faith tested by fire, and the servant whose integrity had earned divine commendation was about to demonstrate that genuine devotion to God could survive even the collapse of every earthly foundation upon which such devotion might have appeared to rest. The first messenger arrived as Job sat in the shade of the great oak that had sheltered 3 generations of his family, reviewing the accounts that documented another year of unprecedented prosperity. The ledgers spread before him told the story of flocks that had multiplied beyond all reasonable expectation, of trade ventures that had succeeded despite the political uncertainties that plagued the region, of agricultural harvests that had exceeded even the most optimistic projections. The servant who approached carried himself with the awkward gait of one whose normal composure had been shattered by circumstances beyond his comprehension. His clothes, bore the stains of dust and blood. His face reflected the hollow-eyed shock of a man who had witnessed the unthinkable, and his voice, when he finally found the words to speak, carried the trembling cadence of one who struggled to make sense of senseless destruction. The oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them. He began, his account unfolding with the mechanical precision of one who had rehearsed these terrible words during his desperate journey to bring the news. When the Sabians raided and took them away, indeed they have killed the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. The magnitude of the loss struck Job with the force of a physical blow. 500 yoke of oxen represented not merely agricultural equipment, but the foundation of the farming operations that fed his vast household and provided surplus for trade with neighboring communities. The donkeys that had been taken constituted the transportation network that connected his holdings to the broader commercial world, enabling the movement of goods that sustained his far-flung enterprises. Yet even as Job struggled to comprehend the implications of this assault upon his livelihood, the economic dimensions of the loss paled beside the human tragedy that the messenger's report contained. The servants who had been murdered by Sabean raiders were not mere employees, but members of an extended family that had grown around Job's enterprises over decades of mutual loyalty and shared prosperity. He knew their names, their histories, their families. Some had served in his household since their youth, growing old in his service while accumulating the wisdom and experience that made them invaluable supervisors of complex operations. Others were younger men whose talents had been recognized and developed through opportunities that Job's growing enterprises had created. All had been bound to him not merely by contracts of employment, but by relationships of genuine mutual respect and affection. Before Job could fully absorb the implications of this first catastrophe, a second messenger appeared on the horizon, his approach marked by the same urgency that had characterized his predecessor's arrival. The dust cloud that announced his coming seemed to carry with it an ominous promise of additional disaster, and the expression on his face confirmed Job's growing apprehension that the morning's tragedy was far from over. The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, this second bearer of evil tidings proclaimed, his voice barely able to articulate words that seemed to contradict everything that Job had believed about divine protection of the righteous. And I alone have escaped to tell you. The theological implications of this report struck Job with even greater force than its economic impact. Fire from heaven had been associated throughout Hebrew tradition with divine judgment upon wickedness, not divine assault upon righteousness. When fire had fallen from heaven upon Sodom and Gomorrah, it had served as an instrument of justice against societies whose corruption had become intolerable to divine holiness. When fire had consumed Nadab and Abihu in the wilderness, it had punished irreverence in the performance of sacred duties. But Job's sheep had been tended by servants whose faithfulness reflected their master's character, grazing on pastures that had been acquired through honest labor and managed according to principles of justice and mercy. The fire that had consumed them seemed to represent either a terrible mistake in divine administration or a fundamental shift in the relationship between righteousness and blessing that had governed Job's understanding of spiritual reality. 7,000 sheep represented more than mere livestock. They constituted the foundation of the textile industry that had made Job's family wealthy and provided employment for hundreds of workers throughout the region. The wool from these flocks had been processed into cloth that found eager markets from Damascus to Memphis, creating trade relationships that extended Job's influence far beyond the immediate boundaries of his territorial holdings. The servants who had perished with the sheep included some of the most skilled shepherds in the region, men whose understanding of animal husbandry, weather patterns, and grazing management had been developed through lifetimes of experience. Their knowledge had been passed down through generations, creating a repository of practical wisdom that could not be easily replaced, even if the financial resources existed to rebuild the flocks they had tended. As Job reeled from the impact of this second catastrophe, a third messenger materialized from the direction of the northern trade routes, his appearance confirming the pattern of systematic destruction that was rapidly dismantling the empire that had taken decades to construct. The dust that covered his clothing and the exhaustion that marked his features told their own story of desperate flight from scenes of violence and devastation. The Chaldeans formed three bands, raided the camels, and took them away. Yes, and killed the servants with the edge of the sword. He gasped, his words tumbling over each other in his haste to discharge the burden of terrible news. And I alone have escaped to tell you. The loss of 3,000 camels struck at the very heart of Job's commercial empire. These magnificent creatures, bred and trained over generations, represented the technology that made long-distance trade possible across the harsh landscapes of the ancient Near East. Each camel was worth a small fortune, but collectively they constituted an irreplaceable resource that had enabled Job to participate in commercial ventures that lesser merchants could never have contemplated. The trade routes that connected the spice markets of Arabia with the manufacturing centers of Mesopotamia, that carried Egyptian gold northward and Anatolian silver southward, that facilitated the exchange of goods and ideas across the civilized world, all depended upon the caravans of camels that could traverse deserts where other forms of transportation would perish. Job's herds had been among the finest in the region, known for their endurance, their breeding, and their training. The Chaldean raiders who had stolen these animals were no random bandits, but organized military units whose systematic approach to economic warfare suggested coordination that went beyond mere opportunistic plunder. Their ability to strike simultaneously at multiple locations indicated intelligence gathering and strategic planning that transformed isolated raids into a comprehensive assault upon the foundations of Job's prosperity. The servants who had died defending the camels included the master traders, whose knowledge of desert routes, tribal relationships, and commercial practices had made Job's far-flung trading ventures possible. These men had negotiated agreements with tribal chieftains, navigated the complex politics of frontier territories, and managed expeditions that sometimes lasted for months as they traversed the vast distances that separated markets for exotic goods. Even as this third messenger delivered his devastating report, Job's eyes were drawn to movement on the southern horizon, where a fourth figure approached with the same desperate urgency that had marked the arrival of his predecessors. The patriarch's heart, already battered by the succession of catastrophes that had destroyed his livelihood and decimated his workforce, seemed to pause in anticipation of whatever additional tragedy this final messenger would bring. The young man who stumbled into Job's presence bore the marks of horror that surpassed even the trauma that had characterized the previous reports. His clothes were torn, his face was streaked with tears and dirt, and his entire demeanor spoke of grief so profound that it seemed to have broken something fundamental in his spirit. When he finally found the strength to speak, his words carried the weight of ultimate tragedy. "Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house," he began, his voice breaking as he struggled to continue. And suddenly, a great wind came from across the wilderness and struck the four corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they are dead. And I alone have escaped to tell you. The magnitude of this final catastrophe dwarfed all the economic losses that had preceded it. Possessions could be replaced, enterprises could be rebuilt, commercial relationships could be reestablished. But children once lost were gone forever. The 7 sons and 3 daughters who had been the crown of Job's prosperity, the living testimony to divine blessing upon his household, the inheritors of everything he had worked to accomplish, all had perished in a single moment of natural disaster. The wind that had destroyed the house was no ordinary storm, but a phenomenon of devastating power that had struck with surgical precision at the moment when all of Job's children were gathered together. The timing seemed almost malevolent in its efficiency. eliminating the entire next generation of his family in one catastrophic blow while leaving him alive to experience the full weight of his loss. The children who had died represented more than the natural affection that any parent feels for offspring. They embodied the hope for continuity that gave meaning to all temporal achievement. Job's enterprises had been built not merely for his own enrichment, but as a legacy for the sons who would inherit his wisdom and extend his influence into future generations. His daughters had been raised to serve as living examples of the character and beauty that reflected their father's devotion to divine truth. The house where they had gathered for their regular celebration of family fellowship had been constructed with the finest materials and crafted by the most skilled artisans available in the region. Its collapse under the force of the supernatural wind seemed to mock the human assumption that careful planning and superior construction could provide security against the forces that shaped human destiny. As the final messenger completed his terrible report and stood waiting for some response from the master whose world had been destroyed in a single day, Job rose slowly from his seat beneath the oak tree that had sheltered his family for generations. The ledgers that had documented his prosperity lay scattered where they had fallen, their careful calculations rendered meaningless by the catastrophes that had eliminated everything they had been designed to measure. The response that emerged from Job's lips in this moment of ultimate testing would determine whether Satan's accusations about the conditional nature of human faith would be vindicated or refuted. The adversary had calculated that the systematic destruction of everything that had given Job's life meaning and security would reveal the self-interested foundations upon which his apparent righteousness had been built. Instead, Job's reaction demonstrated the reality of faith that transcended circumstance, devotion that survived disaster, and trust that endured despite the apparent abandonment of divine protection. Rising from his seat, he tore his robe in the traditional expression of grief, shaved his head in acknowledgement of mourning, and fell to the ground in worship, not in despair, but in submission to the sovereignty of the one whose purposes surpassed human understanding. The words that Job spoke in this moment of supreme trial would echo through centuries as the definitive statement of faith tested by fire. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In these few phrases, Job articulated a theology that recognized divine sovereignty over all human experience, acknowledged the temporary nature of all earthly possession, and maintained blessing of the divine name even in circumstances that seemed to contradict every assumption about divine care for the righteous. His response revealed a faith that was not conditional upon blessing, but was rather the foundation upon which blessing was properly received and its loss properly endured. The narrator's concluding observation, "In all this, Job did not sin nor charge God with wrong," provided the divine assessment of Job's response to his testing. Despite the magnitude of his losses, despite the apparent absence of divine protection, despite the theological questions that such suffering raised about the nature of divine justice, Job's faith had remained intact, and his integrity had been preserved. Satan's first assault upon Job's faith had failed to produce the cursing of God that the adversary had predicted. The destruction of wealth, livestock, and family had not revealed conditional righteousness, but had rather demonstrated the reality of genuine devotion that could survive even the loss of everything that had made life comfortable and meaningful. The hedge of protection had been lowered, but the faith it had protected had proved strong enough to stand without external support. Yet even as Job maintained his integrity through this first wave of testing, forces were already in motion for a second and more comprehensive assault upon his faith. Satan's failure to break Job's spirit through economic and family disaster would lead to an escalation of the testing that would attack not merely his external circumstances, but his physical body itself, creating a trial that would test the limits of human endurance and the depth of genuine faith in ways that even the first catastrophes had not achieved. Satan's appearance among the heavenly host carried with it an aura of frustrated malice that testified to his failure to achieve the objective he had pursued with such confident prediction. The adversary, who had been so certain that Job's righteousness was merely sophisticated selfishness, now found himself confronted with evidence that genuine faith could indeed survive the loss of everything that appeared to sustain it. The Lord's inquiry, identical to that which had initiated the first testing, carried implications that went far beyond mere repetition. From where do you come? The question seemed designed to highlight the futility of Satan's wandering, the emptiness of his mission, and the ultimate powerlessness of his rebellion against divine purposes that could not be thwarted by any created opposition. Satan's response, from going to and fro on the earth and from walking back and forth on it, revealed the same restless energy that had characterized his previous appearance, but now it carried undertones of defensive justification rather than confident accusation. His systematic survey of human weakness had been challenged by an example of strength that did not fit the patterns he had observed throughout his exploration of fallen creation. The divine commendation of Job that followed carried even greater weight than the original praise, for it acknowledged not merely inherent character, but character tested and proven under the most extreme circumstances. Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil? And still he holds fast to his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without cause. The phrase "without cause" revealed the divine perspective on the testing that Job had endured. From heaven's viewpoint, the catastrophes that had destroyed Job's prosperity and family were not punishments for sin or corrections for failure, but rather demonstrations of faith that served purposes transcending individual experience. The suffering had been permitted not because Job deserved it, but because he was worthy of it, worthy to serve as the supreme example of genuine devotion under trial. Satan's response to this vindication of Job's integrity revealed both his tactical adaptability and his fundamental misunderstanding of human nature. Skin for skin. Yes, all that a man has he will give for his life. But stretch out your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will surely curse you to your face. The accusation implicit in Satan's new strategy acknowledged the failure of his first approach while proposing a more sophisticated understanding of human motivation. He conceded that Job had indeed demonstrated willingness to sacrifice material prosperity for the sake of maintaining his relationship with God, but he argued that this sacrifice had been possible only because Job's physical health had remained intact. The phrase "skin for skin" reflected Satan's belief that human beings operated according to a hierarchy of values that placed physical survival above all other considerations. According to this cynical assessment, people might indeed sacrifice wealth, position, and even family relationships if such sacrifices were necessary to preserve their own lives, but they would inevitably choose self-preservation over spiritual integrity when forced to make that ultimate choice. Satan's new proposal to attack Job's physical body rather than his external circumstances represented an escalation of the testing that would probe depths of faith that had not been explored through the previous trials. Physical suffering possessed characteristics that distinguished it from other forms of trial. It was inescapable, intensely personal, and capable of wearing down resistance through relentless persistence in ways that even the most severe external losses could not achieve. The permission that God granted for this second phase of testing carried the same careful limitations that had characterized the first authorization. Behold, he is in your hand, but spare his life. The adversary was authorized to attack Job's physical body with any form of suffering short of death itself, but the fundamental boundary that preserved the servant's life remained inviolate. This limitation revealed the divine purpose that governed even the most severe trials. The testing was designed to demonstrate faith, not to destroy the faithful. The suffering that would follow was not punitive but probative, intended not to break Job's spirit, but to reveal its true strength, not to disprove divine wisdom in choosing such a servant, but to vindicate that wisdom before the watching universe. The disease that Satan inflicted upon Job represented one of the most comprehensive and devastating forms of physical suffering known to the ancient world. Painful boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head described a condition that left no part of his body untouched by agony, that transformed every movement into torture, and that rendered even the basic functions of existence sources of excruciating pain. The boils that covered Job's body were not merely painful, but socially isolating, marking him as unclean according to the religious and cultural standards of his time. The man who had been respected as a pillar of community righteousness was now regarded as someone whose condition suggested divine displeasure, whose presence was considered potentially contaminating, and whose suffering was interpreted by many as evidence of hidden sin finally receiving its appropriate punishment. The physical symptoms of Job's condition extended far beyond the visible manifestations of the boils themselves. The constant pain that radiated through his body made sleep impossible, transforming the night hours that should have provided respite into periods of intensified agony. The fever that accompanied his condition created alternating episodes of burning heat and chilling cold that left him weakened and disoriented. The social isolation that his condition imposed was in some ways more devastating than the physical pain itself. The man who had been sought out for counsel and respected for his wisdom was now avoided by former friends and associates who feared both physical contamination and social association with someone whose suffering suggested divine disapproval. The community that had once gathered around Job's wealth and influence now scattered in the face of his apparent fall from divine favor. Job's response to this new dimension of suffering demonstrated both his humanity and his continuing faith. He took a piece of broken pottery to scrape his boils, seeking whatever minimal relief such crude treatment might provide, and sat among the ashes that had come to symbolize mourning and desolation throughout the ancient Near East. Yet even in this posture of ultimate humiliation, he maintained the dignity that came from unbroken trust in divine sovereignty. The ash heap where Job sought refuge had traditionally served as a place where the community's outcasts gathered, the diseased, the destitute, the ritually unclean, who were excluded from normal social intercourse. For the former patriarch to take his place among these marginalized people represented a reversal of fortune so complete that it challenged every assumption about the relationship between righteousness and blessing that had governed his society's understanding of divine justice. Yet, it was in this context of physical agony and social isolation that Job would receive what may have been the most devastating blow of all. The counsel of his wife, whose response to their shared tragedy would test his faith in ways that neither economic loss nor physical suffering had accomplished. The woman who had shared his prosperity and his position would now become an instrument of temptation that threatened to undermine the very foundations of his endurance. "Do you still hold fast to your integrity?" she asked, her words carrying the bitter edge of one whose own faith had been shattered by the catastrophes that had destroyed their former life. "Curse God and die." The advice she offered was born not of malice but of despair, not of hatred for her husband, but of inability to comprehend how maintaining faith could be worth the suffering it seemed to entail. Her words reflected the practical atheism that suffering often produces in those who have never developed resources for understanding divine purposes that transcend immediate experience. From her perspective, Job's continued faithfulness in the face of such comprehensive disaster was either foolish stubbornness or misguided loyalty to a God who had clearly abandoned them to forces beyond their control. The suggestion that Job should curse God and die was not merely advice to commit spiritual suicide, but a proposal that he acknowledge what appeared to be the obvious conclusion to be drawn from their circumstances, that divine justice was either non-existent or operating according to principles so obscure as to be meaningless for practical purposes. If righteousness led to such suffering, then righteousness itself was questionable. If faithfulness produced such abandonment, then faithfulness was futile. Job's response to his wife's counsel revealed both his compassion for her weakness and his determination to maintain the integrity that had sustained him through every trial. You speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God, and shall we not accept adversity? His words reflected not harshness toward her, but clarity about the principles that must govern faith in a world where divine purposes often remained hidden from human understanding. The question that Job posed, shall we indeed accept good from God, and shall we not accept adversity, articulated a theology that recognized divine sovereignty over all human experience, not merely those aspects that human beings found pleasant or comprehensible. His faith was not conditional upon understanding divine purposes, but was rather grounded in trust in divine character that remained constant regardless of changing circumstances. The narrator's repeated observation, in all this Job did not sin with his lips, provided the divine assessment of Job's response to this second and more severe phase of testing. Despite the comprehensive nature of his suffering, despite the social isolation that his condition had produced, despite the temptation presented by his wife's counsel, Job's integrity remained intact, and his faith proved stronger than his circumstances. Yet even as Job passed this second test, his trials were far from over. The physical suffering that racked his body would continue for months, creating a context of prolonged agony that would provide the backdrop for the theological discussions that would form the heart of his story. The friends who would soon arrive to offer comfort would instead become additional sources of trial, as their well-intentioned counsel revealed the inadequacy of conventional wisdom to address the deepest questions about suffering and divine justice. The ash heap where Job sat in his misery would become a classroom where the most profound questions about faith, suffering, and divine sovereignty would be explored through dialogue that would challenge every easy answer and every comfortable assumption about how God relates to human experience. The man who had been tested by loss and by pain was about to be tested by the counsel of friends whose theology could not comprehend suffering that was not directly connected to personal sin. The stage was set for the great debate that would occupy the central portion of Job's story, where the conventional wisdom that connected righteousness with prosperity would be challenged by the reality of righteous suffering, and where the depths of divine wisdom would be revealed through the inadequacy of human attempts to explain divine purposes according to the limited categories of finite understanding. In his silence and his pain, Job would become the focal point for an exploration of questions that had haunted human consciousness since the fall. Why do the righteous suffer? How can divine justice be reconciled with the apparent randomness of human experience? Is faith possible in the absence of understanding? And is trust meaningful when it cannot be supported by comprehensive explanation of divine purposes? The answers to these questions would emerge not through philosophical argument, but through the crucible of lived experience, not through abstract speculation, but through the testimony of faith tested by fire and proven stronger than every force that had been arrayed against it. Job's journey from prosperity through suffering toward restored understanding would demonstrate that genuine faith transcends explanation, that authentic trust survives even the collapse of theological systems, and that the relationship between God and humanity operates according to principles that surpass the comprehension of finite minds. Among those who received these reports were three men whose friendship with Job had been forged through decades of mutual respect and shared prosperity. Eliphaz the Temanite, whose reputation for wisdom had earned him recognition throughout the southern territories, received word of his friend's trials while conducting business in the markets of Edom. Bildad the Shuhite learned of the disasters while managing his own extensive holdings in the regions east of the Jordan. Zophar the Naamathite heard the news during a council of regional leaders where Job's absence from their deliberations had prompted inquiries about his welfare. Each of these men had reason to grieve the news of Job's suffering beyond the natural sympathy that friends feel for one another's misfortunes. Their relationships with the afflicted patriarch had provided them with connections to trade networks, political alliances, and sources of wisdom that had enriched their own understanding and enhanced their own prosperity. Job's fall represented not merely personal tragedy, but the collapse of an entire system of relationships that had benefited all who had participated in it. Yet the motivation that drew these three friends to make the difficult journey to Job's location transcended calculations of self-interest or even conventional obligations of friendship. They had known Job and his prosperity, had witnessed the integrity that governed his business dealings, had observed the justice that characterized his treatment of servants and subordinates, and had respected the wisdom that made his counsel sought after throughout the region. The reports that reached them described suffering so comprehensive and devastating that it challenged their most fundamental assumptions about divine justice and the relationship between righteousness and blessing. If Job, whose character they had observed firsthand and whose devotion to God had been exemplary, could be subjected to such trials, then the theological framework that governed their understanding of how divine providence operated in human affairs required serious reconsideration. The decision to travel together to offer comfort and support reflected both their concern for their friend and their need to understand how such catastrophic reversal could befall someone whose life had seemed to embody the principles that their religious tradition taught would guarantee divine blessing. Their journey became a pilgrimage of sorts, an attempt to make sense of circumstances that threatened to undermine everything they believed about cosmic justice. The coordination required for their simultaneous arrival, they made an appointment together to come and mourn with him and to comfort him, demonstrated the seriousness with which they approached their mission. Each man had responsibilities that made extended absence costly, yet all recognized that the magnitude of Job's crisis demanded their personal presence rather than mere expressions of sympathy conveyed through messengers. The journey to Job's location carried them through territories that bore witness to the scope of the disasters that had befallen their friend. The fields where his oxen had plowed lay fallow, their productivity destroyed, not merely by the loss of animals, but by the absence of the management structure that Job's enterprises had provided. The hillsides where his sheep had grazed showed signs of neglect, their careful cultivation abandoned in the wake of the catastrophe that had eliminated both flocks and shepherds. The approach to the place where Job had taken refuge among the ash and refuse of his former prosperity challenged the three friends' ability to maintain the composure that their social positions normally required. The figure they encountered bore little resemblance to the dignified patriarch whose presence had once commanded respect in councils of regional leaders and whose wisdom had been sought by those facing complex decisions. When they raised their eyes from afar and did not recognize him, they lifted their voices and wept. The physical transformation that suffering had wrought in Job's appearance shocked his friends in ways that no second-hand reports could have prepared them to expect. The disease that covered his body had not merely caused pain, but had altered his features so dramatically that the man they had known was barely recognizable beneath the ravages of his affliction. The response of Job's friends to their first sight of his condition revealed both the genuineness of their affection and the depth of their horror at what had befallen him. Each one tore his robe and sprinkled dust on his head toward heaven. These traditional expressions of grief and solidarity demonstrated their willingness to share in their friend's humiliation, to identify themselves with his suffering, even at the cost of their own dignity and social standing. The 7 days of silence that followed their arrival represented one of the most profound expressions of sympathy recorded in ancient literature. So they sat down with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his grief was very great. Their silence was not the result of inability to find appropriate words of comfort, but rather recognition that the magnitude of Job's suffering transcended the reach of conventional consolation. During this week of shared silence, the three friends had opportunity to observe the extent of their friend's physical and emotional anguish while wrestling with their own theological confusion about how such comprehensive disaster could befall someone whose character they had witnessed and respected. The conventional wisdom that they had inherited from their religious traditions provided no adequate explanation for righteous suffering of such intensity and duration. The silence that characterized this initial period of their visit created space for reflection that might have led to genuine understanding of the mysteries that govern divine providence in a fallen world. Their willingness to share Job's humiliation by sitting with him on the ash heap demonstrated a quality of friendship that transcended social conventions and personal comfort. Yet the theological assumptions that they brought to their observation of his suffering would ultimately transform them from comforters into additional sources of trial. The breaking of the silence would come not from the friends, but from Job himself, whose endurance finally reached the point where internal pressure demanded external expression. The words that burst from his lips after 7 days of agonized reflection would reveal the human cost of maintaining faith in circumstances that seemed to contradict every assumption about divine care for the righteous. After this, Job opened his mouth and cursed his day. The curse that followed was directed not against God, as Satan had predicted, but against the day of his birth, against the circumstances that had brought him into existence to experience such comprehensive suffering. His words reflected not loss of faith, but the anguish of faith tested beyond normal human endurance. May the day perish on which I was born, and the night in which it was said, "A male child is conceived." Job's lament challenged not divine justice, but the value of existence itself under circumstances that made every breath a source of pain and every moment of consciousness an exercise in endurance. His curse was directed against time rather than eternity, against circumstance rather than sovereignty. The poetry that poured from Job's lips revealed a mind that had wrestled with the deepest questions about human existence while maintaining intellectual and spiritual integrity despite circumstances that might have driven lesser men to either denial or despair. His words demonstrated that faith could coexist with honest acknowledgement of suffering's reality, that trust in divine character could survive even when divine purposes remained incomprehensible. Why did I not die at birth? Why did I not perish when I came from the womb? The questions that Job raised were not merely rhetorical expressions of self-pity, but serious inquiries into the nature of divine purpose that allowed suffering to continue when relief through death might have seemed merciful. His wrestling with these issues reflected the intellectual honesty that refused to accept easy answers to complex questions. The theological sophistication of Job's lament distinguished it from mere complaint or self-indulgent wallowing in misery. His words revealed a mind that understood the implications of divine sovereignty while struggling to reconcile that understanding with lived experience of apparently meaningless suffering. The tension between faith and experience that his words expressed would drive the debates that were about to unfold. For now, I would have lain still and been quiet. I would have been asleep, then I would have been at rest. Job's meditation on death as potential relief from suffering revealed not suicidal ideation, but rather philosophical consideration of existence's value under extreme circumstances. His words reflected the natural human longing for peace that suffering inevitably produces, while maintaining recognition of the boundaries that govern human choice. The response that Job's words would provoke from his three friends would demonstrate the inadequacy of conventional theological wisdom to address the deepest questions about suffering and divine justice. Their attempts to provide comfort would become sources of additional trial as they applied theological formulas that could not accommodate the reality of righteous suffering. Eliphaz would speak first, his words carrying the authority of one whose wisdom had been recognized throughout the region, but whose understanding had been shaped by theological assumptions that could not comprehend suffering disconnected from personal sin. His counsel would reflect genuine concern for his friend, combined with inability to accept the possibility that conventional wisdom might be insufficient to explain extraordinary circumstances. The great debate that would follow would explore every aspect of the relationship between righteousness and blessing, between faith and understanding, between human wisdom and divine purpose. Through cycles of speech and response, accusation and defense, conventional wisdom and experiential knowledge, the friends would exhaust the resources of human theology while Job maintained his integrity, despite their increasing pressure for him to confess sins that would explain his suffering. The inadequacy of their counsel would ultimately prepare the way for divine intervention that would transcend human categories of explanation while vindicating Job's maintenance of faith despite circumstances that had tested that faith beyond normal human limits. The ash heap where he sat in anguish would become a classroom where the deepest mysteries of divine human relationship would be explored through dialogue that revealed both the limits of human understanding and the sufficiency of divine wisdom to govern affairs that surpass finite comprehension. The friends who had come to offer comfort would unwittingly serve divine purposes by providing the context within which Job's faith would be refined to its purest form, stripped of every external support and every intellectual prop until it rested upon nothing but trust in the character of God, whose ways transcend human understanding, but whose justice remains absolute despite appearances that might suggest otherwise. Eliphaz the Temanite spoke first, his words carrying the measured authority of one whose reputation for wisdom had been established through decades of successful counsel to those facing difficult decisions. His approach reflected both genuine concern for his friend and confidence in theological principles that had served him well in previous encounters with human suffering. Yet the very assumptions that had made his wisdom valuable in conventional circumstances would prove inadequate to address the unprecedented nature of Job's trials. "If one attempts a word with you, will you become weary?" Eliphaz began, his tone reflecting awareness that his counsel might not be welcome, while simultaneously asserting his obligation to speak truth regardless of its reception. His question revealed the delicate balance that he sought to maintain between friendship and theological conviction, between sympathy and what he perceived as necessary correction. The wisdom that Eliphaz proceeded to share reflected the accumulated insight of generations who had observed the patterns that seemed to govern divine administration of justice in human affairs. "Remember now, who ever perished being innocent, or where were the upright ever cut off?" His words articulated the fundamental assumption that undergirded ancient Near Eastern theology, that divine justice operated according to predictable principles that connected righteousness with blessing and wickedness with judgment. The agricultural metaphor that Eliphaz employed to illustrate his point, "Even as I have seen, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same," reflected the natural order that seemed to govern both physical and moral causation. Just as farmers could expect to harvest crops that corresponded to the seeds they planted, so human beings could expect to experience consequences that reflected the moral quality of their choices and actions. Yet even as Eliphaz articulated this conventional wisdom with confidence born of long observation, his application to Job's circumstances revealed the inadequacy of such simplistic formulations to address the complexity of divine purposes. The suffering that had befallen his friend was so comprehensive and devastating that it seemed to require either acknowledgement that Job's apparent righteousness had been superficial, or admission that divine justice operated according to principles more mysterious than conventional theology recognized. Eliphaz's account of a supernatural vision, "A word was secretly brought to me, and my ear received a whisper of it," represented his attempt to support his theological position with authority that transcended human observation. The spirit that had appeared to him in the night had supposedly confirmed the principle that no mortal could be righteous before God, that all human beings were inherently flawed, and that apparent innocence was merely ignorance of hidden corruption. The message that this spirit had delivered, "Shall mortal man be more righteous than God? Shall a man be more pure than his Maker?" seemed designed to humble human pride while justifying suffering as inevitable consequence of universal human sinfulness. According to this interpretation, Job's trials were not exceptional, but rather normal expressions of divine justice applied to creatures whose righteousness was always relative rather than absolute. Job's response to Eliphaz's counsel revealed both his intellectual sophistication and his emotional anguish as he struggled to maintain integrity while acknowledging the validity of some theological points while rejecting their application to his circumstances. "Oh, that my grief were fully weighed, and my calamity laid with it on the scales." His words reflected not self-pity, but rather a plea for accurate assessment of the magnitude of his suffering relative to any sins that might justify such comprehensive judgment. The imagery that Job employed to describe his condition, "Therefore my words have been rash," acknowledged that extreme suffering might lead to intemperate expression while maintaining that such expression was understandable given the circumstances that had produced it. His honesty about his own weakness created space for genuine dialogue while refusing to accept explanations that seemed inadequate to account for the severity of his trials. "What strength do I have that I should hope, and what is my end that I should prolong my life?" Job's questions revealed the existential crisis that comprehensive suffering had created, the challenge to find meaning and purpose when every source of significance had been stripped away. His words reflected not loss of faith, but rather the struggle to maintain faith when its foundations had been tested beyond normal human limits. The second cycle of speeches brought Bildad the Shuhite into the conversation, his contribution reflecting a more systematic and historical approach to the theological questions that Job's suffering had raised. Where Eliphaz had relied upon personal vision and general observation, Bildad appealed to the accumulated wisdom of previous generations and the patterns that careful study of history seemed to reveal. "Inquire, please, of the former age, and consider the things discovered by their fathers," Bildad counseled, his words reflecting confidence that careful study of the past would provide adequate guidance for understanding present circumstances. His approach represented the scholarly tradition that sought to discern divine purposes through systematic examination of how providence had operated throughout human history. The botanical metaphors that Bildad employed, "Can the rush grow up without a marsh? Can the reeds flourish without water?" were designed to illustrate the principle that all prosperity depended upon appropriate spiritual conditions, just as plant life required suitable environmental factors. According to this analysis, Job's former success had necessarily been rooted in righteousness, while his current suffering must indicate that those spiritual foundations had somehow been compromised. "So are the paths of all who forget God, and the hope of the hypocrite shall perish," Bildad declared, his words applying the botanical analogy directly to Job's circumstances. The logic was inexorable according to conventional wisdom. If Job was suffering, he must have forgotten God. If he had forgotten God, his previous righteousness must have been hypocrisy. If it had been hypocrisy, his current trials were simply divine justice, finally revealing truth that had previously been hidden. Job's response to Bildad revealed the growing frustration of one whose lived experience contradicted the theological systems that his friends insisted upon applying to his circumstances. "Truly I know it is so. But how can a man be righteous before God? His acknowledgement of divine transcendence was accompanied by challenge to his friends' assumption that they possessed adequate understanding of how that transcendence operated in specific human situations. The legal metaphor that Job employed, if he wished to contend with him, he could not answer him one time out of 1,000, reflected his recognition that finite creatures could never fully comprehend infinite purposes, that human understanding of divine justice was necessarily limited, and that theological systems that claimed to explain all suffering in terms of personal sin might themselves be presumptuous. Zophar the Naamathite entered the debate with even greater confidence in conventional wisdom, his words reflecting impatience with Job's refusal to accept explanations that seemed obvious to those whose theology had not been challenged by extraordinary circumstances. Should not the multitude of words be answered, and should a man full of talk be vindicated? His questions revealed both irritation with Job's continued protestations of innocence and certainty that accumulated tradition provided adequate resources for understanding any situation. The accusation that Zophar leveled was the most direct yet offered. For you have said, "My doctrine is pure, and I am clean in your eyes." But oh, that God would speak and open his lips against you, that he would show you the secrets of wisdom. His words reflected confidence that divine revelation would expose the hidden sins that alone could account for Job's comprehensive suffering. Know therefore that God exacts from you less than your iniquity deserves, Zophar proclaimed, his conclusion representing the ultimate expression of conventional theological wisdom applied to exceptional circumstances. According to this analysis, Job was not suffering unjustly, but was rather experiencing less judgment than his sins actually merited, making his complaints not merely inappropriate, but actually evidence of spiritual blindness. The cycles of debate that followed would see each friend elaborate upon these basic themes with increasing sophistication and decreasing sympathy. Eliphaz would develop his emphasis on universal human sinfulness. Bildad would extend his historical analysis of divine justice, and Zophar would intensify his accusations of hidden wickedness. Yet none would prove capable of acknowledging that their theological categories might be inadequate to explain circumstances that transcended normal human experience. Job's responses throughout these debates would demonstrate the possibility of maintaining faith while acknowledging the inadequacy of conventional theological explanations for exceptional suffering. His words would reveal a mind capable of sophisticated theological reflection, combined with a heart that refused to compromise integrity despite pressure from friends whose good intentions could not compensate for their theological limitations. Though he slay me, yet will I trust him, Job declared in what would become perhaps the most famous expression of faith under trial ever recorded. His words reflected not passive resignation, but active choice to maintain trust in divine character, despite circumstances that seemed to contradict everything he had believed about divine care for the righteous. The progression of the debates would reveal the bankruptcy of conventional wisdom when applied to exceptional circumstances, while demonstrating that genuine faith could survive even the collapse of theological systems that had previously provided structure and meaning. Job's refusal to accept explanations that required him to confess sins he had not committed would ultimately prepare the way for divine intervention that would transcend all human categories of explanation. The friends who had come to provide comfort would unwittingly serve to refine Job's faith to its essential core, stripping away every external support until it rested upon nothing but trust in the character of God, whose purposes surpassed human understanding. Their failure to provide adequate explanation for his suffering would create the context within which divine wisdom would eventually be revealed through means that none of the human participants in the debate could have anticipated or comprehended. The ash heap where these conversations took place would become a theater where the deepest questions about faith, suffering, and divine sovereignty would be explored through dialogue that exhausted human wisdom while preparing the way for revelation that would transcend every limitation of finite understanding. The inadequacy of the Friends' Council would serve divine purposes by demonstrating that the relationship between God and humanity operated according to principles that surpassed the categories available to even the wisest human observers. Into this silence came a voice that had been listening throughout the extended dialogue, a voice that belonged to one whose youth had initially counseled restraint, but whose growing indignation at the failure of wisdom to produce truth had finally overcome the deference that age traditionally commanded. Elihu, son of Barachel the Buzite, had waited through the lengthy exchanges with the patience that his culture demanded of the young in the presence of their elders, but his silence had been preparation rather than passivity. I am young in years, and you are very old. Therefore I was afraid and dared not declare my opinion to you, Elihu began, his words acknowledging the social protocols that had governed his restraint, while simultaneously announcing his intention to transcend those limitations. His deference to age was real, but his conviction that truth transcended social convention was stronger than his respect for cultural norms. The anger that had built within Elihu during the debates was directed not merely at Job's refusal to accept his friend's explanations, but at the failure of all four participants to recognize the sovereignty of God that might permit suffering for purposes beyond human comprehension. My wrath is aroused against Job because he justified himself rather than God, he declared, his words reflecting theological sophistication that recognized issues the previous debaters had not adequately addressed. Yet Elihu's contribution to the conversation, passionate as it was, would prove to be merely another example of human wisdom attempting to explain divine purposes according to finite categories of understanding. His youth brought fresh perspective but not ultimate insight. His passion provided new energy but not final answers. His reverence for divine sovereignty offered better foundation but not complete explanation for the mysteries that Job's suffering had revealed. The speeches that Elihu delivered demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of human theology at its most sophisticated level. His recognition that God might use suffering for purposes of education and correction rather than merely punishment showed insight that surpassed the crude retribution theology of the three friends. His emphasis on divine transcendence and the limitation of human understanding pointed toward truths that the previous debate had not adequately acknowledged. For God may speak in one way or in another, yet man does not perceive it. Elihu observed, his words recognizing the possibility that divine communication might transcend the categories that human beings normally employed to understand supernatural revelation. His insight that suffering might serve instructional purposes represented a significant advance over the simple correlation between sin and judgment that had dominated the previous discussions. Yet even Elihu's more sophisticated theology would prove inadequate to address the fundamental questions that Job's experience had raised about the relationship between righteousness and suffering, between faith and understanding, between human wisdom and divine purpose. His contribution would serve to exhaust one more avenue of human explanation while preparing the way for intervention that would transcend all finite attempts to comprehend infinite wisdom. The dramatic shift that would transform the entire character of the dialogue came not through human insight, but through divine intervention that announced itself with all the cosmic authority of the Creator addressing his creation. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind, the narrator recorded, the simple statement marking one of the most significant moments of divine self-revelation in all of Scripture. The whirlwind from which God spoke was not merely meteorological phenomenon, but theophanic manifestation that recalled the glory cloud that had led Israel through the wilderness, the fire that had descended upon Mount Sinai, the presence that had filled the tabernacle, and later the temple. The mode of divine appearance reflected both the transcendence that distinguished Creator from creation and the immanence that made communication between heaven and earth possible. The questions that poured forth from the divine voice challenged every assumption about human competence to understand cosmic purposes while simultaneously demonstrating the vastness of divine wisdom and power. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding, the Lord demanded, his words placing human existence in perspective that revealed both its significance as divine creation and its limitation as finite reality. The catalog of natural wonders that followed, the forming of the earth, the boundaries of the sea, the patterns of light and darkness, the movements of celestial bodies, served not to humiliate human ignorance, but to reveal the scope of divine wisdom that governed all existence according to purposes that transcended human comprehension. Each question demonstrated another aspect of creative power that human beings could observe but never fully understand. Have you commanded the morning since your days began and caused the dawn to know its place? God asked, his words revealing the daily miracle of sunrise that human beings experience but never controlled. The natural order that provided the context for human existence operated according to divine purposes that surpassed human ability to direct or even adequately comprehend. The parade of creatures that God described in detail, from the mountain goats that gave birth in the wilderness to the war horse that charged into battle without fear, demonstrated the diversity and complexity of creation that reflected divine wisdom in its design and divine care in its preservation. Each animal possessed characteristics that served purposes within the larger economy of creation, while displaying aspects of divine creativity that human observation could appreciate but never duplicate. Job's initial response to this overwhelming display of divine majesty revealed both his humanity and his wisdom. Behold, I am vile. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand over my mouth. His reaction was not self-abasement, but rather recognition of the vast disparity between finite and infinite understanding, between creature and creator, between human questions and divine wisdom. The second cycle of divine speech focused upon two magnificent creatures, Behemoth and Leviathan, whose power and ferocity challenged human confidence, inability to control, or even understand the forces that shaped natural existence. These creatures, whether understood as specific animals or symbolic representations of chaos and power, embodied aspects of creation that demonstrated divine sovereignty over forces that human beings could neither master nor comprehend. Look now at the behemoth, which I made along with you, God declared, his words emphasizing both the commonality that linked all creatures as products of divine creation and the diversity that reflected the vastness of divine imagination, the strength that characterized this creature. His strength is in his hips and his power is in his stomach muscles, represented natural force that human technology could not match and human wisdom could not fully fathom. The description of Leviathan that followed revealed divine power over forces that represented chaos and opposition to divine order. Can you draw out Leviathan with a hook or snare his tongue with a line which you lower? The questions challenged human confidence in technological mastery while revealing divine sovereignty over powers that transcended human ability to control or comprehend. Job's final response demonstrated the transformation that divine revelation had accomplished in his understanding of the relationship between faith and comprehension, between trust and explanation, between human wisdom and divine purpose. I know that you can do everything, and that no purpose of yours can be withheld from you, he declared, his words acknowledging divine sovereignty while confessing the limitation of human understanding. The confession that followed revealed the heart of Job's spiritual journey. I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore, I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes. His words marked not merely intellectual acknowledgement of divine greatness, but experiential encounter with divine presence that transformed his understanding of both God and himself. The repentance that Job expressed was not confession of the specific sins that his friends had insisted must explain his suffering, but rather recognition that his demands for explanation had reflected insufficient appreciation of the vast difference between finite and infinite understanding. His abhorrence was directed not at his character, but at his presumption in attempting to judge divine purposes according to the limited categories of human comprehension. The divine restoration that followed Job's submission vindicated his maintenance of integrity throughout his trials, while simultaneously demonstrating that God's purposes in permitting suffering transcended the retribution theology that had dominated the previous discussions. Now the Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning, the narrator recorded, the simple statement marking the completion of testing that had served purposes beyond Job's understanding. The doubling of Job's possessions, 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, 1,000 female donkeys, represented more than mere restoration, but rather divine blessing that exceeded even his former prosperity. The mathematical precision of the restoration reflected divine justice that operated according to principles that transcended human understanding, while demonstrating care that encompassed both suffering and blessing within larger purposes. The gift of 7 more sons and 3 more daughters provided healing for the deepest wound that Job's trials had inflicted, while acknowledging that some losses could be compensated but never truly replaced. The daughters whose beauty became legendary throughout the region, Jemimah, Keziah, and Karen Happuch, received inheritance alongside their brothers, a departure from conventional practice that reflected the special character of God's blessing upon this tested family. The 140 years that Job lived after his restoration, seeing his children and grandchildren for 4 generations, provided time for reflection upon the lessons learned through suffering, while demonstrating that divine purposes encompassed both trial and blessing within the larger narrative of faithful relationship. His longevity became testimony to divine faithfulness that operated according to principles surpassing human understanding. The friends who had provided inadequate counsel received correction that revealed the error of their theological presumption while acknowledging the sincerity of their intentions. My wrath is aroused against you and your 2 friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has, God declared, his words vindicating Job's maintenance of integrity while correcting the friends' misapplication of conventional wisdom. The sacrificial offering that God required from the friends, with Job serving as intercessor, demonstrated both divine mercy toward those who had erred in good faith and the priestly role that suffering had prepared Job to fulfill on behalf of others. His prayers for those who had added to his trials revealed the transformation that divine encounter had accomplished in his character. The story that had begun with cosmic questions about the nature of faith, the reality of disinterested devotion, and the relationship between righteousness and blessing concluded with answers that transcended the categories within which those questions had been framed. Job's experience demonstrated that genuine faith could indeed survive the loss of everything that appeared to sustain it. That authentic relationship with God could transcend understanding of divine purposes, and that trust could endure even when explanation proved impossible. The ash heap where Job had sat in his anguish became a monument to faith tested by fire and proven stronger than every force arrayed against it. The suffering that had seemed to threaten divine justice ultimately vindicated divine wisdom in choosing a servant capable of demonstrating that the relationship between creator and creature operated according to principles that surpassed finite comprehension while remaining grounded in infinite love. The book that bore Job's name would echo through centuries as testimony to the possibility of faith that transcended explanation, trust that survived the collapse of theological systems, and devotion that proved its authenticity through perseverance under trial. His story became the supreme example of testing that revealed character, suffering that served divine purposes, and restoration that demonstrated the ultimate triumph of divine purposes over every force that sought to frustrate them. In the end, Job's journey from prosperity through suffering to restored understanding revealed truths about divine sovereignty, human faith, and the mystery of suffering that no amount of theological speculation could have discovered. His experience demonstrated that the deepest questions about divine justice find their answers not in human explanation, but in divine encounter, not in intellectual comprehension, but in experiential trust, not in theoretical understanding, but in practical submission to the wisdom of one whose thoughts transcend human thoughts as the heavens transcend the earth.